I got the assignment papers from Oscar on a Tuesday morning in late October. Nothing unusual about that. He'd been handing me folders for the better part of 15 years, and I'd stopped expecting surprises. But when he set this one down on my desk, he didn't walk away like he usually did. "This one's different, Randy," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses the way he did when something was bothering him. "Remote monitoring station up north. You'll be alone for a week." I opened the manila folder and found a single sheet with coordinates written in Oscar's careful handwriting. The numbers meant nothing to me yet, but I could tell from the sequence they were deep in the northern Appalachian wilderness, way deeper than our usual patrol routes. "What kind of monitoring?" I asked. Oscar sat down across from my desk, which was another thing he didn't usually do. In all my years working under him, Oscar Warner was a stand-up kind of supervisor. Quick meetings, clear instructions, then back to his office to deal with whatever paperwork was choking his desk that day. "Strange incidents over the past month," he said. "Unexplained sounds. Missing hikers." I'd heard about the missing hikers. 3 of them in the last 4 weeks, all experienced backpackers who knew the trails. Search and rescue had come up empty each time. No equipment found, no signs of struggle, no bodies. People just vanished. What kind of sounds? Campers have been calling in complaints, voices in the woods at night, sounds that don't match any wildlife we've got in the area. Oscar pulled off his glasses and cleaned them with his shirt. Could be nothing. Probably is nothing. But the state wants eyes on the ground. I looked at the coordinates again. The numbers were starting to make sense now, and I didn't like what they were telling me. This was backcountry territory, the kind of place where cell service died, and the nearest road was a suggestion more than a fact. "1 week at an isolated cabin," Oscar continued. "Daily patrols, file reports every evening, standard procedure." Standard procedure. Oscar loved that phrase. It was his answer to everything that didn't fit neatly into the filing cabinets that lined his office walls. Missing hikers? Standard search protocol. Strange sounds in the woods? Standard monitoring procedure. I'd learned not to argue with standard procedure. "When do I leave?" "Today. Cabin's already stocked with supplies." Oscar stood up and straightened his pressed khaki shirt. "Any questions?" I had plenty of questions, but none that Oscar would want to answer. Why send one ranger instead of a team? Why me specifically? Why did he look like he hadn't slept well in days? But I'd been doing this job long enough to know when to keep my mouth shut. "No questions," I said. Oscar nodded and headed for the door, then stopped. "Randy, be careful up there." That was the part that stuck with me as I packed my gear. Oscar wasn't the type to add personal warnings to official assignments. He dealt in protocols and procedures, not feelings and hunches, but something in his voice made me pack an extra flashlight. The drive took 3 hours along increasingly narrow dirt roads. I started on State Highway 47, which was decent asphalt with yellow lines and guardrails. Then I turned onto County Road 16, which was still paved but barely wide enough for 2 cars. After that came Forest Service Road 93, which was gravel and optimism. The last 20 minutes were on what the map generously called a road, but looked more like a hiking trail that had gotten ideas above its station. My truck complained the whole way, grinding over rocks and fallen branches while pine trees scraped against the windows. I kept checking the GPS coordinates on my handheld unit, but the signal was getting weaker with every mile. When I finally reached the coordinates, I understood why they'd needed specific numbers to find this place. The cabin sat in a small clearing that you'd drive right past if you weren't looking for it. Dense pine and oak trees pressed in from all sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that only scattered patches of gray October sky showed through. I parked next to the cabin and got out to stretch my legs. The silence hit me first. No traffic sounds, no distant machinery, no human noise at all. Just wind moving through pine needles and the occasional creak of settling wood. After 15 years of ranger work, I was used to quiet places, but this felt different. Heavier, somehow. The cabin itself was old but solid. Weathered log construction with a stone chimney and a covered porch that had seen better decades. Someone had maintained it over the years. The roof looked intact and the windows were clean. A metal sign by the front door read, "Forest Service Station 12," in faded green letters. I grabbed my duffel bag and the box of additional supplies I'd packed, then walked up to the front door. The key was where Oscar said it would be, under a loose stone next to the steps. Old-fashioned security, but effective enough when the nearest neighbor was probably 20 miles away. The door opened with a squeal of hinges that echoed through the trees. I stepped inside and found exactly what I'd expected from a remote Forest Service cabin. Basic furnishings designed for function over comfort. A narrow cot with a thin mattress pushed against one wall. A wooden table with 2 chairs that had probably been there since the Carter administration. A wood-burning stove that would be my primary heat source for the next week. Shelves along the back wall were stocked with canned food, bottled water, and basic supplies. Someone had done a thorough job preparing the place. I counted enough food for 10 days, which was more than the week I'd been assigned. Either they were being cautious, or they expected I might need to stay longer than planned. I set my gear on the cot and looked around more carefully. The cabin was clean, but had that unused smell of a place that sat empty most of the time. Dust motes drifted through the afternoon light coming through the windows. The floorboards creaked under my boots, solid but aged. That's when I noticed the folded piece of paper on the table. It was sitting right in the center, placed deliberately where anyone entering the cabin would see it. The paper looked old, yellowed at the edges with a texture that suggested it had been handled many times. My name wasn't on it, which meant it was either left for whoever got assigned to this station or it had been there for a while. I picked it up and unfolded it carefully. The paper felt fragile, like it might tear if I wasn't gentle. Inside, someone had written 4 lines in black ink that had faded to a brownish color. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the precision of someone who wanted to make sure their message was clear. The first rule said to keep all lights off between 1 and 3 in the morning, no exceptions, no variations. Just complete darkness during those 2 hours. The second rule was about responding to knocks. If someone knocked on the door during those hours, I was supposed to say, "There is no one here," not "Who's there?" or "Come back in the morning." Those exact words, "There is no one here." The third rule told me to avoid all windows during that same time period. Stay away from them completely. Don't look out. Don't even go near them. The fourth rule was the simplest and somehow the most unsettling. Ignore any sounds or voices outside during those hours. No matter what I heard, no matter how urgent or familiar it might sound, I was supposed to ignore it completely. I read through the rules 3 more times, making sure I understood each one correctly. The handwriting was clear enough, but the content didn't make much sense. These weren't standard Forest Service procedures. They read more like warnings, the kind of folk wisdom that gets passed down when official channels don't have adequate explanations. I held the paper up to the window light and examined it more closely. The ink had definitely faded with age, and the paper had that slightly brittle feel of something that had been written months or maybe years ago. Whoever wrote this had taken their time, forming each letter carefully. This wasn't a quick note scribbled in haste. Someone had thought about these rules, considered them important enough to write down and leave for the next person. The question was whether I should take them seriously or file them under local folklore and superstition. In 15 years of ranger work, I'd heard plenty of stories about strange things in the woods. Most of them turned out to be perfectly normal wildlife behavior or the overactive imagination of city folks who weren't used to how quiet and dark the wilderness could get at night. But Oscar's warning kept echoing in my head. Be careful up there. And the missing hikers were real enough. 3 experienced backpackers don't just vanish without a trace unless something unusual is happening. I folded the note and slipped it into my shirt pocket. Whether I believed in the rules or not, I figured it couldn't hurt to follow them. 2 hours of darkness and silence seemed like a small price to pay for whatever peace of mind they might provide. The afternoon was getting late, and I had work to do before sunset. I needed to unpack my gear, get familiar with the area around the cabin, and figure out my patrol routes for the next week. But first, I wanted to test the radio and file my initial report with Oscar. I pulled out my handheld radio and tried to raise the main station. Static filled the speaker for several seconds before Oscar's voice came through, faint but clear enough to understand. Station 12. This is base. Go ahead, Randy. Base, this is Station 12. I've reached the coordinates and secured the cabin, beginning initial survey of the area. Copy that, Station 12. Any issues with the facility? I looked around the cabin again, my hand touching the folded note in my pocket. Negative, base. Facility is secure and well stocked. We'll begin patrols tomorrow morning. Understood. Maintain regular contact and file daily reports. Base out. The radio went quiet, leaving me alone with the silence and the lengthening shadows outside the windows. I had maybe 2 hours of good daylight left, enough time to walk the perimeter and get a feel for the immediate area. Tomorrow, I'd start the real work, hiking the trails and looking for whatever had been causing the strange incidents Oscar mentioned. But tonight, I'd follow the rules. Keep the lights off between 1 and 3. Stay away from the windows. Ignore whatever sounds might come from the darkness outside. I examined the note one more time, studying the faded ink and careful handwriting. Someone had taken the time to write these rules down and leave them for the next person. That suggested they'd learned something during their stay here, something important enough to pass along. I heated up a can of beef stew on the wood-burning stove and ate it straight from the pot, standing at the table while I studied the topographical map Oscar had included in my supply pack. The contour lines showed the terrain around the cabin in detail. Steep ridges to the north and east, a creek running roughly parallel to the access road about half a mile south, and several marked trails that intersected in this area. Made sense why they'd put a monitoring station here. You could cover a lot of ground from this central location, and the elevation gave you decent sight lines through the trees during daylight hours. I traced potential patrol routes with my finger, planning how I'd divide up the search area over the next few days. Start with the immediate vicinity tomorrow, maybe a 2-mile radius. Work outward from there. The missing hikers had to be somewhere. 3 experienced people don't just vanish without leaving some kind of trace. Equipment gets dropped, clothing gets snagged on branches, someone leaves footprints in soft ground. Even if they'd gotten lost, which seemed unlikely given their experience level, there should be signs of where they'd been. I folded the map and set it aside, then checked my gear one more time. Radio charged and working, extra batteries for the flashlight, first aid kit stocked, everything I'd need for a systematic search of the area. The sun had set while I was eating, and the cabin felt different in the darkness, smaller somehow, like the walls had moved closer. I could hear the wind picking up outside, making the trees creak and sway. Normal forest sounds, nothing unusual about them. But I kept thinking about those rules, written in that careful handwriting, and left where the next person would be sure to find them. Someone had taken the time to figure out what worked and what didn't. That suggested they'd learned through experience, probably the hard way. I set my watch alarm for 12:55 a.m., giving myself enough time to wake up properly before the 1 o'clock deadline. Then I stretched out on the cot, still fully dressed, and tried to get some sleep. Wasn't easy. Every sound outside seemed louder than it should be. A branch scraping against the roof, something small scurrying through the underbrush, the distant call of an owl answered by another one further away. All perfectly normal, but my mind kept cataloging each noise, analyzing it, wondering if it meant something. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, my watch was beeping softly in the darkness. I sat up on the cot and checked the time. 12:55, exactly as I'd set it. 5 minutes to get ready. I was already dressed, so there wasn't much to do except wait and think about what might happen next. The cabin felt different at this hour, quieter somehow, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I couldn't hear any of the usual nighttime sounds. No owls calling, no small animals moving around outside, no wind in the trees, just silence, thick and heavy. At exactly 1 o'clock, I switched off my flashlight. The darkness was complete. No moon tonight, or if there was one, the tree canopy blocked it entirely. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, couldn't make out the shape of the table 3 feet away, couldn't tell where the walls were. It was the kind of absolute blackness you only get in remote places, far from any artificial light. I sat on the edge of the cot and waited. The silence stretched on. No sounds from outside, no creaking of the cabin settling, nothing. It was almost unnatural how quiet everything had gotten. During the day, the forest was full of life, birds calling, insects buzzing, small animals moving through the undergrowth. Even at night, there were usually some sounds, but now, nothing. I found myself straining to hear something, anything, just to break the oppressive quiet. My own breathing seemed too loud. The slight rustle of my clothes when I shifted position sounded like thunder in the stillness. Minutes crawled by. I couldn't check my watch without turning on the flashlight, which the rules specifically prohibited. So I counted seconds in my head, trying to estimate how much time had passed. Probably only 15 or 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Then I heard the owl call again, distant but clear. Normal forest sounds gradually returned, wind stirring the branches, something small moving through dead leaves outside. The oppressive silence lifted and the cabin felt like a normal place again instead of some kind of sensory deprivation chamber. I kept sitting in the darkness, following the rules exactly as written. No lights, no looking toward the windows, no matter what I might hear outside. The person who'd written those rules had learned something during their time here, something important enough to pass along to whoever came next. At 3 o'clock, I'd been counting carefully. I switched my flashlight back on. The familiar objects of the cabin jumped into view, looking exactly as I'd left them. Table, chairs, stove, supplies on the shelves, everything normal. I checked my watch to confirm the time, then lay back down on the cot. The first night was over, and nothing had happened. Just 2 hours of sitting in the dark, listening to normal forest sounds. Maybe the rules were just precautionary. Maybe whoever had written them was being overly careful, responding to sounds that had perfectly ordinary explanations. But they'd taken the time to write them down and leave them for the next person, which suggested they'd considered the warnings important. I'd follow them again tomorrow night, and the night after that, until my assignment was finished. The second day passed without incident. I spent 8 hours hiking patrol routes, covering the immediate area around the cabin in a systematic grid pattern. Found plenty of animal tracks, some old campsites, a few pieces of litter left by careless hikers. But no sign of the 3 missing people. I radioed my report to Oscar that evening, keeping it brief and factual. No unusual findings, no evidence related to the missing hikers, patrol continuing as planned. He acknowledged and signed off without asking for details. That night, I followed the same routine. Ate dinner, reviewed my notes from the day's patrol, set my alarm for 12:55. Lay down on the cot and tried to sleep, listening to the normal sounds of the forest outside. The alarm woke me right on schedule. I sat up, checked the time, and waited for 1 o'clock. The silence descended again, just like the night before. Complete quiet, as if someone had thrown a switch and turned off all the life in the forest. I switched off my flashlight and settled in for another 2-hour wait in the darkness. For the first hour or so, nothing happened. The same oppressive quiet, the same strain of trying to hear something in the silence. I counted seconds and minutes, estimating the passage of time, wondering how much longer until 3 o'clock. Then, around 2:30 by my rough calculation, I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, just the soft sound of someone walking on dead leaves and forest debris. but they were definitely footsteps. Too regular and deliberate to be an animal moving around. Someone was walking outside the cabin. I sat perfectly still on the cot, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps moved around the perimeter. They seemed to circle the cabin slowly, staying maybe 20 or 30 feet away from the walls. Steady, measured steps, like someone taking their time to examine the building from all angles. The rules said to ignore any sounds outside during the 1 to 3 period, no matter how urgent or familiar they might seem. So I stayed put and tried not to think about who might be walking around out there in the complete darkness. Could be one of the missing hikers, lost and confused, finally making their way back to civilization. Could be another ranger, sent by Oscar to check on me. Could be a local resident who knew about the cabin and was curious about the lights they might have seen during the day. Or it could be something else entirely. The footsteps continued their slow circuit around the cabin. I wanted to get up and look out one of the windows, see who was out there, maybe call out and ask if they needed help. But the rules were specific about avoiding the windows completely during these hours. Someone had learned these rules through experience. They'd written them down carefully and left them where the next person would find them. That suggested the rules worked, that following them was the safe course of action. So I sat in the darkness and listened as the footsteps made their slow circle around the cabin. Once, twice, 3 times, always staying the same distance away, never approaching the door or windows directly. Then, gradually, the sound faded. The footsteps moved away into the forest, growing fainter and fainter until I couldn't hear them anymore. The oppressive silence returned, thick and heavy as before. I waited until what felt like 3 o'clock, then turned my flashlight back on and checked my watch. 3:02 a.m. Close enough. Everything in the cabin looked normal. Table, chairs, supplies, all exactly as I'd left them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, walking around in the darkness, examining the cabin for reasons I couldn't begin to guess. I lay back down on the cot, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about those footsteps, so deliberate and measured, not the random movement of someone who was lost or confused. More like someone who knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. In the morning, I'd check for tracks around the cabin, see if I could find any evidence of who had been walking around out there. But for now, I just lay in the darkness and wondered if the note's warnings were based on real experiences rather than paranoid imagination. The rules had kept me inside during whatever had happened out there. Maybe that was the point. I set my watch alarm for 12:55 and stretched out on the cot again. 3rd night doing this. Part of me had started to wonder if I was getting too comfortable with the routine, lying here in the dark, following rules written by someone I'd never met. But the footsteps from last night kept coming back to me, the way they'd circled the cabin with such purpose. I checked for tracks this morning like I'd planned. Found them too. Boot prints in the soft earth near the back corner of the cabin, where the ground stayed damp from runoff. Size 11 or 12, with a distinctive tread pattern. Hiking boots, good ones. The prints formed a clear path around the building, exactly matching what I'd heard. 3 complete circuits, just like the footsteps had sounded. What bothered me wasn't finding the tracks. It was how fresh they looked. Clean edges, no debris settled in the impressions. And they were the only human tracks I'd found anywhere around the cabin. Not near the door, not on the path to my truck, nowhere else. Just that perfect circle around the building during the hours when the rules said to stay inside. The alarm went off and I shut it down fast. 12:55. 5 minutes to go. I'd been thinking about those missing hikers all day while I worked my patrol routes. 3 experienced people don't just vanish without leaving some kind of trail, unless they'd encountered whatever was making those nighttime visits to the cabin, unless they hadn't known about the rules. 1 o'clock. I switched off the flashlight. The darkness settled around me like it had the previous nights. Complete and thick, with that same immediate silence that wasn't natural for a forest. No owls, no small animals rustling through the underbrush, no wind moving through the branches, just my own breathing and the sound of my clothes against the cot when I shifted position. I gripped the flashlight in my right hand and forced myself to stay still. The rules were specific about ignoring sounds, but they didn't say anything about being ready. Having the light in my hand made me feel slightly less helpless, even though I couldn't use it. The silence stretched on. I started counting seconds again, trying to estimate the time. 1001, 1002. It helped keep my mind focused on something other than the darkness pressing in from all sides. The cabin felt smaller at night, like the walls had moved closer while I wasn't looking. Around 1900, maybe 15 minutes in, I heard something different. Whispers. Faint at first. So quiet I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. But they were there, just outside the cabin walls. Soft voices having some kind of conversation. Too low for me to make out individual words. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the front porch, but it was hard to tell for sure in the darkness. I tightened my grip on the flashlight. The metal felt solid and real in my palm, an anchor to something I could control. But I kept it switched off. The rules were clear about no lights between 1 and 3. No exceptions. The whispers continued, and gradually I could tell there was more than one voice. At least 2, maybe 3 people talking in hushed tones. The conversation had a rhythm to it. One voice would speak for a few seconds, then another would respond. Back and forth, like they were discussing something important. My heart started beating faster. These weren't random sounds or animals moving around outside. This was people. Multiple people, standing close enough to the cabin that I could hear their voices through the walls. I strained to catch actual words, but they kept their voices just below the threshold where I could understand them, intentionally quiet, like they knew someone might be listening. The whispers had a deliberate quality that reminded me of the footsteps from the night before, purposeful and controlled. The voices moved. I could track them as they shifted position around the cabin's perimeter, the sound growing slightly louder or softer as they got closer or farther from where I sat. They seemed to be walking slowly, still talking in those same hushed tones. Sometimes one voice would stop talking, and only the others continued. Sometimes they all went quiet for a few seconds before starting up again. I forced myself to keep staring straight ahead at the far wall. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to look out the windows, to see who was out there and what they were doing. The curtains were drawn, but I could pull one back just a little. Just enough to get a glimpse, but the rules said to avoid the windows completely during these hours. Not just keep the curtains closed, avoid them entirely. And after finding those boot prints this morning, I wasn't about to start ignoring the instructions now. The whispers grew louder. Not loud enough for me to understand the words, but definitely more audible than when they'd started. I could distinguish 3 separate voices now, 2 that sounded deeper, probably male, and one that was higher pitched. They were having an actual conversation out there, moving around the cabin while they talked. One of the voices laughed, quiet and brief, but unmistakably a laugh. The sound made my skin crawl. Whatever they were discussing, someone found it amusing. The voices stopped directly outside what I thought was the living room window. The one about 6 feet to my left, behind the drawn curtains. They were close enough now that I could almost make out individual words, but not quite. Like listening to people talk in the next room with the door closed. I kept my eyes fixed on the far wall and tried to control my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, steady and quiet. The flashlight was getting slippery in my palm from sweat, but I didn't dare adjust my grip. Any movement seemed too risky. The conversation outside continued for what felt like several minutes. The voices would rise and fall in intensity, sometimes overlapping when two people spoke at once. Occasionally, one of them would make a sound that might have been agreement or disagreement, but I couldn't tell which. Then they moved again. The whispers shifted around toward the back of the cabin, growing fainter as they walked away from the living room window. I could still hear them, but they were more distant now. The conversation never stopped, though. They kept talking as they moved, like they were conducting some kind of inspection while they discussed whatever was on their minds. My watch had a faint luminous dial, but I couldn't risk looking at it. The rules said no lights, and I wasn't sure if that included the tiny glow from the watch face. I tried to estimate the time by counting, but I'd lost track during the whispering. Could have been 20 minutes, could have been 40. The voices came around to the other side of the cabin now. They were near the bedroom window, still maintaining those same quiet tones. I wondered if they knew I was inside. The cabin was dark and I'd been completely silent, but that didn't mean much. If they'd been watching the place, they would have seen me arrive 3 days ago. That thought made me feel exposed in a way I didn't like. Sitting here in the darkness while unknown people walked around outside, discussing things I couldn't hear. They had all the advantages: mobility, numbers, knowledge of what was happening. I had nothing except the rules and the hope that following them would keep me safe. The whispers moved toward the front of the cabin again, closer to the door this time and definitely louder. I could catch fragments now, not whole words, but pieces of sounds that almost formed into something recognizable. The conversation seemed more intense, too, with shorter exchanges between the voices. Then everything went quiet. The whispers stopped completely, and the silence returned. But it felt different this time. Not empty like it had been earlier, but full of waiting. Like the calm before something important happened. I sat perfectly still and listened. No voices, no footsteps, no movement of any kind. But I could sense that they were still out there, still close to the cabin, just not talking anymore. The first knock came at 1:45 by my count. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the front door, each one distinct and measured, with a pause between them. The sound echoed through the cabin like gunshots in the silence. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure it would be audible from outside. The flashlight felt like it weighed 10 pounds in my hand. Every muscle in my body wanted to move, to stand up, to turn on the light, to do something other than sit here in the dark while someone knocked on my door. But the rules were specific about this too. If someone knocked during these hours, I had exact words to say. I waited. Maybe they'd go away. Maybe it was just some kind of test and silence was the right response. The knocking came again. 3 more raps, harder this time, more insistent. The door rattled slightly in its frame with each impact. I cleared my throat as quietly as I could and faced toward the front door. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. "There is no one here." The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, like I was denying my own existence, but they were what the note had specified, word for word. The knocking stopped immediately. Not gradually or after a pause. It just ended the moment I finished speaking. Like whoever was out there had gotten the response they were expecting. The whispers started up again, but quieter now, more distant. The voices seemed to be moving away from the door, back toward the perimeter of the cabin. I could barely hear them, just the faint sound of people talking somewhere outside in the darkness. The conversation continued for several more minutes, growing fainter as time passed. Eventually, I couldn't tell if I was still hearing voices or just imagining them. The silence crept back in gradually, replacing the whispers until there was nothing left but the familiar emptiness of the forest at night. I sat on the cot and waited. My heart rate slowly returned to normal, and the sweat on my palms started to dry. The flashlight felt lighter in my hand again. When I estimated that 3 o'clock had arrived, I switched on the light and checked my watch. 3:02. Close enough. Everything in the cabin was exactly as I'd left it. Table, chairs, supplies, all in their proper places. But I knew there would be more tracks outside in the morning. More evidence that the rules weren't just paranoid instructions left by someone with an overactive imagination. They were based on experience. Real encounters with whatever was happening in these woods after dark. I lay back down on the cot, but didn't expect to sleep much. The whispers kept echoing in my memory, and I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly the knocking had stopped when I'd said those specific words. Like they'd been waiting to hear exactly that response. I didn't expect to sleep much after what happened, but exhaustion won out somewhere around 4 a.m. When I woke up, sunlight was filtering through the windows and my watch showed 8:30. I'd slept later than usual, probably because my body was finally catching up with 3 nights of interrupted rest. The first thing I did was check outside for new tracks. Sure enough, there they were. The same boot prints from the night before, but this time they came right up to the front door. The impressions were deep and clear in the soft earth by the steps, like whoever made them had been standing there for a while, putting real weight into it. I knelt down and studied the prints more carefully. The tread pattern was distinctive. A hiking boot, probably expensive given how clean and geometric the lugs were. Size 11 or 12, same as before. But what bothered me was how fresh they looked. No dew in the impressions, no debris blown into them overnight, like they'd been made just before dawn. I followed the trail around the cabin. 3 complete circuits again, but this time the spacing was different. Closer to the walls. Some of the prints were only 2 feet from the foundation, right under the windows. I stopped at the bedroom window and crouched down. The prints here were deeper, like someone had been standing still for a long time. Just standing there, looking in. The thought made my skin crawl. I'd been lying on that cot all night, following the rules, not looking toward the windows. Someone had been right there on the other side of the glass. I radioed Oscar at 9:15. Same routine as the previous days. Brief report, no unusual findings, continuing patrol. He acknowledged and signed off without asking for details. I wondered what he'd say if I told him about the whispers and the knocking. Probably think I was losing it after 3 days alone in the woods. The rest of the day I spent hiking a wider perimeter, pushing out to a 3-mile radius. Still no sign of the missing hikers. No abandoned gear, no disturbed campsites, nothing. It was like they'd just vanished without leaving any trace. But someone was definitely moving around these woods at night. Someone who knew my name and where I was staying. That bothered me more than anything else. I'd introduced myself to Oscar as Randy when I first started working for the Forest Service 2 years ago, but my personnel file would have my full name. Anyone with access to those records could know I was Randy Guerrero, but who would have that kind of access and be wandering around remote monitoring stations in the middle of the night? I got back to the cabin around 5 and heated up another can of stew. The routine was becoming automatic. Eat, clean up, review the rules, set my alarm for 12:55. But tonight felt different. All day I'd had this feeling that something was building up to something bigger. 3 nights of escalating activity, and I couldn't shake the sense that whatever was happening wasn't done with me yet. I read the rules again, studying each word carefully. The handwriting looked even more faded in the lamplight, and I wondered again who had written them. Someone who'd been through this before, obviously. Someone who'd figured out how to survive whatever came calling between 1 and 3 in the morning. The 4th rule bothered me the most. Ignore any sounds or voices outside during those hours, regardless of urgency or familiarity. That word, familiarity. Like whoever wrote the rules knew the voices might sound like people you recognized, people you cared about. I folded the paper and put it in my shirt pocket, then checked my gear one more time. Radio charged, flashlight working, extra batteries within reach. Everything the same as the previous 3 nights. But I had this nagging feeling that tonight wasn't going to be the same at all. My alarm went off at 12:55. I shut it off and lay back down on the cot, fully dressed with my boots still on. The flashlight felt heavier in my hand than usual, and I realized I was gripping it tighter than necessary. At exactly 1 o'clock, I switched it off. The darkness settled around me like a weight. Same complete silence as before. No wind, no animals, no normal forest sounds. Just the oppressive quiet that made my own breathing sound unnaturally loud. I counted seconds in my head trying to track the time, but found it harder to concentrate tonight. My mind kept wandering to those boot prints by the bedroom window. The whispers started at 1:05. This time they were closer. Much closer. The voices seemed to be coming from right outside the walls, maybe only a few feet away. I could hear them more clearly than before. Still hushed conversation, but the words were almost distinguishable. Almost, but not quite. Like listening to people talk in the next room through thin walls. I forced myself to stare straight ahead at the far wall, avoiding the windows completely. The voices moved around the cabin's perimeter, but slower than the previous night. They seemed to be taking their time, pausing at each window. When they reached the living room window to my left, I heard one of them laugh softly. Not a pleasant sound. Then the scratching started. It began at the bedroom window, a slow, deliberate scraping against the wooden exterior, like fingernails dragging across the logs, but deeper, louder. Whatever was making the sound had to be pressing hard against the wall. The scratching moved methodically from the window frame down toward the foundation, then back up. Long, slow strokes that made the wood creak slightly under the pressure. The sound moved to the next window. Same deliberate scraping, like something was testing the walls, seeing how solid they were, or maybe looking for a way in. I'd heard animals scratch at buildings before. Raccoons, bears, even desperate deer in harsh winters. This wasn't that. This was methodical, purposeful. My hands were sweating now, making the flashlight slippery in my grip. I wanted to wipe my palms on my pants, but didn't dare move. The rules didn't say anything about staying perfectly still, but every instinct told me not to make a sound, not to do anything that might draw attention to exactly where I was inside the cabin. The scratching reached the living room window. The sound was so close I could hear individual scrapes, each one distinct. Whatever was making the noise had multiple points of contact. Not fingernails, but something sharper. Claws, maybe. Or tools. The thought that someone might be using tools to scrape at the walls made this whole thing worse somehow. Animals acted on instinct. People with tools had plans. The voices continued their hushed conversation while the scratching moved around the cabin. I caught fragments now. Not words exactly, but the rhythm and cadence of speech. One voice would say something, another would respond. Sometimes they overlapped, like multiple conversations happening at once. The tone was casual, almost friendly, like neighbors chatting over a fence. That's what really got to me. The normalcy of it. If I couldn't hear the scratching, if I didn't know I was alone in the middle of nowhere following rules written by someone who'd obviously been through this before, it would have sounded like perfectly ordinary conversation. People talking about their day, making plans, sharing jokes. But I was alone. And it was 2 a.m, and something was circling my cabin, scratching at the walls while voices discussed things I couldn't quite understand. The scratching completed its circuit and started again. This time it sounded different, more aggressive, more insistent, like whatever was doing it was getting frustrated. The scrapes came faster, overlapping each other. Multiple sources now, working at different windows simultaneously. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing, but that just made the sounds more prominent. The whispers seemed to be getting closer to the walls, and I could swear I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful steps across the wooden boards. Someone walking back and forth in front of the door. That's when I heard my name. Randy. It came from the direction of the front door, whispered just loud enough for me to hear clearly. My blood went cold. The voice was unfamiliar. Not Oscar, not anyone I recognized, but it knew my name. Randy Guerrero. This time from the bedroom window. A different voice, also unfamiliar. The full name, pronounced correctly. I'd never told anyone here my last name except on the paperwork when I first got the assignment. Oscar called me Randy. Everyone at the station called me Randy. But these voices knew my full name. Randy. Randy Guerrero. Randy. Multiple voices now, coming from different directions, all around the cabin. They weren't whispering to each other anymore. They were calling to me, trying to get my attention, and they knew exactly who I was. I gripped the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. The urge to respond was almost overwhelming. When someone calls your name, especially your full name, every social instinct tells you to answer, to acknowledge them. But the rules were clear. Ignore any sounds or voices, regardless of urgency or familiarity. Though these voices weren't familiar, that was the problem. Complete strangers were wandering around my cabin at 2 a.m, calling my name like they knew me personally. How was that possible? The scratching intensified. Now it sounded like multiple sets of claws working at the walls, concentrated around the windows. Long, deep scrapes that seemed to be trying to dig through the wood itself. The cabin creaked under the pressure, and I started to worry about the structural integrity. These walls were old, weathered from years of mountain weather. How much abuse could they take? Randy, we know you're in there. The voice came from right outside the living room window, maybe 3 feet from where I was lying. Clear as day, no longer whispering. A man's voice, calm and conversational, like he was talking to a friend. Randy Guerrero, Forest Service, badge number 4789. My badge number. Jesus Christ. My badge number. That information wasn't public. It wasn't even in most of the paperwork. You'd have to access specific Forest Service databases to get that kind of detail. Who the hell were these people? The scratching stopped abruptly. Complete silence for maybe 30 seconds, then footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps moving toward the front door. I counted them, 5 steps, then a pause. Someone was standing right in front of the door. The first knock came at 2:35 by my count, but this wasn't the measured knocking from the previous nights. This was aggressive, demanding. Someone pounding on the door with both fists, making the entire frame shake. The sound echoed through the cabin like gunshots. Bang, bang, bang. The door rattled in its frame. I could hear the hinges creaking under the assault. Bang, bang, bang. Harder this time. The whole cabin seemed to vibrate with each impact. Dust drifted down from the ceiling beams. I waited for a pause, then spoke the required words. There is no one here. The pounding didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. Faster, more frantic, like whoever was out there was trying to break down the door through sheer force. The frame groaned with each impact, and I started to worry it might actually give way. Bang, 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 bang. Continuous now, no rhythm or pattern, just relentless hammering that made the entire cabin shake. The windows rattled in their frames. Items on the shelves shifted and clinked together. This wasn't knocking anymore, this was an assault. I said the words again, louder. There is no one here. No effect. The pounding continued, joined now by scratching at multiple windows. The sounds overlapped into a cacophony of scraping and banging that seemed to come from every direction at once, like the entire cabin was under siege. Minutes passed. The assault was relentless, never pausing, never slowing down. My watch showed 2:40 when I checked it, then 2:45. The pounding had been going on for 10 solid minutes without stopping. The door frame was holding, but I could see it flexing with each impact. The hinges were starting to pull away from the wood, Then, at exactly 2:50 by my watch, everything stopped. Complete silence. No pounding, no scratching, no voices. The sudden quiet was almost as unsettling as the noise had been. I lay perfectly still, listening for any sound that might indicate what was happening outside. Nothing. Just the oppressive silence that had become familiar over the past 4 nights. I stayed motionless on the cot, flashlight gripped in my sweating hand, waiting for something else to happen. But the silence stretched on. Whatever had been attacking the cabin was gone, leaving only the memory of that relentless pounding and the knowledge that they knew far more about me than they should have. I stuffed my gear into the duffel bag, making sure everything was accounted for. Radio, extra batteries, first aid kit, the topographical map Oscar had given me. My hands moved automatically through the routine, but my mind kept drifting back to last night. The pounding on the door, the way they'd known my name, my badge number. Information that shouldn't have been available to anyone wandering around in the woods. The cabin looked smaller in daylight, less threatening. Just a basic Forest Service station with standard-issue furniture and supplies. Hard to believe the things that had happened here over the past 4 nights. But the scratches on the window frames were real enough. I'd checked them this morning, deep gouges in the wood that definitely hadn't been there when I'd arrived. I swept the floor and wiped down the table, leaving everything the way I'd found it. Standard procedure when vacating a station. The canned goods went back on the shelves in neat rows. The wood stove got cleaned out. The cot got stripped and the bedding folded. Just another week in the field, according to anyone who might check the logs. The note sat in the center of the table where I'd found it 5 days ago. Same yellowed paper, same careful handwriting. I'd read those 4 rules so many times I could recite them from memory. Keep all lights off between 1 and 3 a.m. Respond to knocking with, "There is no one here." Avoid the windows completely during those hours. Ignore any sounds or voices outside, no matter how urgent or familiar they seemed. Someone had written those rules for a reason. Someone who'd been through what I'd just experienced, maybe worse. They'd taken the time to preserve that information for whoever came next, and it had probably saved my life, or at least my sanity. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the exact spot where I'd discovered it. Center of the table, positioned so the next person couldn't miss it. Whoever got assigned here after me would need those rules. They'd need to know what they were dealing with, even if they didn't believe it at first. The sound of an engine reached me through the trees, right on time. I grabbed my duffel and headed outside, squinting in the morning sunlight. A Forest Service truck was making its way down the narrow access road, bouncing over the ruts and potholes. Green paint, standard government plates. My replacement had arrived. The truck pulled up next to mine and the engine shut off. The driver's door opened and a ranger stepped out. Medium height, athletic build, short black hair. He wore the same uniform I did, khaki shirt and dark green pants with black boots. Professional appearance. Everything regulation. "Randy Guerrero," he called out. "That's me." I walked over and extended my hand. "You must be my relief." Evan Ramirez. His handshake was firm, confident. "Chief Warner sent me up to take over the monitoring station." I nodded. Evan looked competent enough, probably had plenty of field experience. He'd need it up here, though he didn't know that yet. "How much did Oscar tell you about the assignment?" "Standard patrol duties. Keep an eye on the area for any unusual activity. He mentioned there'd been some missing hikers in the region." Evan glanced around the clearing, taking in the cabin and surrounding forest. "Seems quiet enough." Quiet. If only he knew. "It can be. Let me show you around, get you oriented." I spent the next hour walking Evan through the basics, showed him the cabin layout, the supply inventory, the radio setup for daily check-ins with headquarters. We went over the patrol routes on Oscar's topographical map, and I pointed out the key landmarks, the creek to the south, the ridge lines to the north and east, the intersecting trail system. "Water comes from the hand pump out back," I explained, leading him around the cabin's perimeter. "It's good water, but you'll want to treat it anyway. Wood for the stove is stacked on the side porch. Should be enough to last you through the week. Evan took notes in a small notebook, asking practical questions about radio protocols and patrol schedules. Standard stuff. I kept waiting for him to notice the scratches on the window frames, but he was focused on the operational details. Probably better that way. "Any problems during your week up here?" he asked as we finished the walkthrough. I hesitated. This was the moment I'd been thinking about all morning. How much should I tell him? The rational part of my mind said I should warn him, prepare him for what might happen after dark. But another part wondered if that would just make things worse. Maybe knowing too much in advance would make him paranoid, cause him to make mistakes. "Nothing major," I said finally. "Quiet week, like you said. You'll want to follow standard safety protocols, especially at night. Keep your radio charged, stay alert." It wasn't really a lie, more like an incomplete truth. Evan would figure out the rest soon enough, assuming the things in the woods decided to pay him a visit too. The note would help him when the time came. That's what it was there for. Sounds straightforward. Evan closed his notebook and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "Appreciate the briefing." We shook hands again and I threw my duffel into the back of my truck. The engine turned over on the second try, settling into its familiar rough idle. I'd be glad to get back to civilization, sleep in my own bed without worrying about what might be scratching at the windows. "Take care of yourself up here," I told Evan through the open window. "Will do. Safe drive back." I put the truck in gear and started down the access road, watching the cabin shrink in my rearview mirror. Evan was already heading inside, probably eager to get settled. I hoped he'd find the note before nightfall. More importantly, I hoped he'd take it seriously when he did. The drive back to headquarters took the same 3 hours as the trip up, but in reverse. The unnamed forest road gave way to gravel, then pavement, then actual highways with traffic and cell phone coverage. Normal civilization, where the worst thing you had to worry about was running out of gas or getting a speeding ticket. I pulled into the parking lot at the district office a little after noon. The building looked exactly the same as when I'd left. Brown brick, government-issue architecture, American flag hanging limp in the still air. I grabbed my gear and headed inside, nodding to the receptionist as I made my way to Oscar's office. He was at his desk, reading something on his computer screen. Looked up when I knocked on the door frame. "Randy, how'd it go up there?" "Quiet week." I set my duffel down and took the chair across from his desk. No sign of those missing hikers. Covered a pretty wide area, but didn't find any traces. Oscar nodded, making a note in a file folder. "Well, we had to try. Thanks for taking that assignment on short notice." "No problem." I pulled out the topographical map and handed it back to him. "Your replacement showed up right on schedule. Evan Ramirez. Seemed like he knew what he was doing." Good. Oscar filed the map away and turned back to his computer. "I'll need you to fill out the standard weekly report before you head home. Just the basics. Patrol routes, weather conditions, any wildlife observations." The report took about 20 minutes to complete. I kept it factual and brief, documenting my daily activities without mentioning anything unusual. Hiked the northern sector on Tuesday, covered the eastern trails on Wednesday, checked the creek area on Thursday. Weather clear, temperatures seasonal. Observed deer, squirrels, various bird species. No signs of missing persons, no incidents to report. It felt strange, writing such a mundane summary of the week I'd just experienced. But what was I supposed to put? Encountered unknown entities that knew my personal information and tried to break down the cabin door? That would earn me a psychological evaluation and probably a desk assignment for the foreseeable future. I signed the report and handed it to Oscar. He glanced it over and nodded approvingly. "Looks good. Take the rest of the day off. You've earned it." I stood up to leave, then paused. "Actually, I wanted to ask you about my next assignment. What have you got lined up for me?" Oscar looked up from the report, frowning slightly. Next assignment? What do you mean? Well, Ramirez is covering the northern station now. I figured you'd have something else for me to work on. The frown deepened. Randy, what are you talking about? What northern station? A cold feeling started forming in my stomach. The monitoring station. The coordinates you gave me on Tuesday, where I just spent the last week. Oscar stared at me for a long moment, then turned to his computer and started typing. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, pulling up what looked like scheduling records and assignment databases. Randy, I'm not showing any assignment to a northern monitoring station. According to our system, you've been on administrative leave this week. The cold feeling spread upward into my chest. That's not right. You gave me the coordinates yourself in this office. Tuesday morning, you had the folder right there on your desk. Oscar's typing became more urgent, pulling up different screens and cross-referencing databases. I'm checking all our active monitoring stations. We've got facilities in the Southern District, the Eastern Watershed area, and the Fire Tower Complex, but nothing at the coordinates you're describing. That's impossible. I leaned forward, watching the computer screen. Station 12, that's what the sign said. Forest Service Station 12. Randy. Oscar's voice was careful, the way you'd talk to someone who might be having a breakdown. We don't have a Station 12. Our numbering system only goes up to 8, and those are all accounted for. My mouth felt dry. Check Evan Ramirez's assignment. He should be logged as taking over from me this morning. More typing. Oscar pulled up what looked like a personnel roster and scrolled through the names. Found Ramirez and clicked on his record. Evan Ramirez is assigned to the Southern District Fire Prevention Unit. Has been all week. According to this, he's been conducting prescribed burns down near the state line. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what Oscar was telling me. That can't be right. I just handed the station over to him 3 hours ago. We went through the whole briefing, patrol routes, radio protocols, everything. Oscar turned the computer monitor so I could see the screen. Ramirez's assignment record was right there in black and white. Southern District Fire Prevention duties, assigned Monday through Friday of this week. No mention of any northern monitoring station. Randy, I think we need to talk about where you've actually been this week. I sat there staring at the computer screen, trying to make sense of what Oscar was telling me. The assignment record for Ramirez was right there in black and white. Southern District Fire Prevention duties, Monday through Friday. No mention of any monitoring station. That's not possible, I said. My voice sounded strange in the quiet office. I just left him there. We went through everything, the radio protocols, the patrol routes where the supplies were kept. Hell, I showed him how to work the hand pump. Oscar leaned back in his chair and studied me. I'd known him for 8 years, and I'd never seen that expression on his face before. Not concern, exactly. More like he was trying to solve a puzzle and I was the missing piece that didn't fit anywhere. Randy, I need you to think about this carefully. You're telling me you spent a week at a monitoring station that doesn't exist, talking to a ranger who was actually 200 miles away doing controlled burns. I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. The words sounded crazy when he put it like that. But I could still feel the morning chill from that cabin. Still remember the weight of my gear when I'd loaded it into the truck. My back ached from sleeping on that narrow cot for 6 nights. Maybe you need more time off, Oscar said. His tone was gentle, the way you talk to someone who was fragile. Sometimes isolation can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're dealing with stress. Stress, that's what he thought this was. Some kind of breakdown. I stood up from the chair. I'm fine, Oscar. I know what I experienced. I'm sure you do, but the records don't lie. You've been on administrative leave all week. I signed the paperwork myself last Monday. Administrative leave. I tried to remember signing any paperwork. Tried to recall Oscar mentioning time off. Nothing. Just that manila folder on my desk with the coordinates written in his handwriting. The assignment sheet, I said. You gave me the coordinates. Your handwriting. Oscar frowned. What assignment sheet? I reached for my shirt pocket, then stopped. The note I'd been thinking about was the one with the 4 rules, the yellowed paper I'd found on the cabin table. But there had been an assignment sheet, hadn't there? Oscar had placed it on my desk that Tuesday morning, except now I couldn't quite picture it. The memory felt slippery, like trying to hold water in my hands. Randy, I think you should go home. Take a few more days. If you want to talk to someone, the department has counselors. I don't need a counselor. But even as I said it, doubt was creeping in. The whole week felt solid in my memory, real as anything I'd ever experienced. The taste of that canned stew, the sound of my boots on the forest floor, the weight of the flashlight in my sweaty palm while those voices called my name in the darkness. My badge number. They'd known my badge number. I'll go home, I said. Oscar nodded. Take care of yourself. We'll talk next week. I walked out of his office and through the main room where 3 other rangers were processing paperwork. None of them looked up. Everything was normal, routine, exactly like it should be on a Friday afternoon. Like I hadn't just spent 7 days in a place that apparently didn't exist. The parking lot was half empty. My truck sat in the same spot where I'd left it that morning after driving back from the cabin. The same truck I'd loaded with gear 7 days ago, then unloaded at coordinates that weren't on any official map. I climbed behind the wheel and just sat there for a while. The afternoon sun was warm through the windshield, and I could hear traffic from the main road. Normal sounds. Real sounds. Not like that oppressive silence that had fallen over the forest every night at 1 a.m. My hand went to my shirt pocket without thinking about it. The paper was still there, folded exactly the way I'd left it. I pulled it out carefully and unfolded it on the steering wheel. 4 rules, written in faded black ink on yellowed paper. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with obvious thought. This wasn't something I'd imagined or dreamed. This was real paper, real ink, real words that someone had taken the time to write down. Rule 1. Keep all lights off between 1 and 3 a.m. No exceptions. Rule 2. If someone knocks during those hours, respond with, "There is no one here." Rule 3. Avoid all windows during the 1 to 3 a.m. period completely. Rule 4. Ignore any sounds or voices outside during those hours, regardless of urgency or familiarity. I read them 3 times just like I had that first day. The paper felt authentic between my fingers, worn soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded. The ink had that faded quality that comes with age, not the sharp darkness of something written recently. This note existed. Whatever else might be confused or wrong about my memories, this physical evidence was sitting right here in my hands. Someone had written these rules. Someone had thought they were important enough to leave behind for the next person. I folded the paper back up and slipped it into my pocket. Then I started the truck and drove home. My house was a small ranch-style place on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy but comfortable enough for a man living alone. I'd bought it 5 years ago when I'd gotten serious about staying in this job long-term. The mortgage payment wasn't much, and I liked having space between me and my neighbors. I parked in the driveway and sat in the truck for a few more minutes, looking at the front porch and the windows that needed new screens. Everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. The newspaper was still on the steps where it had been thrown that morning. My coffee mug was probably still sitting on the kitchen counter where I'd left it before driving to the office. But had I left it there this morning? Or had I left it there a week ago, before Oscar gave me that assignment? The memories were getting tangled up. I could remember both versions now, leaving for the office this morning after a quiet week at home, and leaving for the cabin 7 days ago with a truck full of gear. Both felt equally real, equally true. I went inside and walked through the rooms slowly. The kitchen was clean, the way I always left it. The coffee mug was in the sink, rinsed, but not washed. Normal. The living room looked undisturbed. My bedroom was neat, bed made, clothes hung up in the closet. Nothing suggested I'd been away for a week, but nothing suggested I'd been here either. I went to the bedroom and opened the top drawer of my nightstand. It was mostly empty, a few pens, some spare change, a small flashlight I kept for power outages. I took the folded note from my pocket and placed it carefully in the back corner of the drawer, behind everything else. The paper looked strange lying there among my ordinary belongings. Too old, too weathered, like something that belonged in a museum instead of a bedroom drawer. But it was mine now. The only proof I had that something had happened, even if I couldn't prove what. I closed the drawer and sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, I could hear a dog barking somewhere down the street, and the distant sound of someone mowing their lawn. Normal Friday afternoon sounds in a normal town where normal people did normal things. But I wasn't normal anymore. I'd spent 6 nights following rules written by someone who understood that certain hours brought danger. I'd heard voices that knew my name and badge number. I'd felt the cabin shake under the weight of something pounding on the door with inhuman strength. And according to official records, none of it had ever happened. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Sleep would be good. I'd been running on too little rest for days now, and my body was tired in ways that went deeper than just physical exhaustion. But I wasn't sure I wanted to sleep. Dreams might bring back those whispers, those measured footsteps circling in the darkness. The afternoon wore on. I made dinner, watched some television, tried to read a book. Normal activities that felt strange now, like I was playing a role in someone else's life. Every so often, I'd catch myself listening for sounds that didn't belong, footsteps on the porch, scratching at the windows, voices calling my name. But there was nothing. Just the ordinary sounds of evening in a quiet neighborhood. Around 10 o'clock, I went to bed. I set my alarm for 7 a.m., the way I always did, and turned off the lights. The darkness in my bedroom was different from the darkness in that cabin. Softer somehow, less oppressive. Light from the street lamp filtered through the curtains, and I could hear cars passing on the road. I didn't set an alarm for 12:55. There were no rules to follow here, no need to count seconds in the darkness while something circled outside. This was my house, my life, my normal existence, but I kept the drawer close. The note was right there, just a few feet away. Proof that I hadn't imagined everything. Proof that somewhere, somehow, there was a place where the rules mattered, and following them was the difference between safety and something much worse. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow I'd figure out what to do next. Tonight I just wanted to rest in my own bed and listen to normal sounds and pretend that everything made sense. But deep down, I knew I'd never speak about the cabin again. Who would believe me? Oscar thought I'd had some kind of breakdown. The record showed I'd been on leave. There was no Station 12, no monitoring assignment, no Evan Ramirez waiting to take over duties that didn't officially exist. I'd survived something that had never happened, and I'd carry that knowledge with me for as long as I lived. The note would stay in the drawer, waiting. Sometimes late at night when sleep wouldn't come, I'd take it out and read those 4 rules again. I'd remember the whispers and the scratching and the sound of my own voice saying, "There is no one here," to whatever had been pounding on that door. I'd remember, even if no one else ever would.